I'm going to start this morning with a discussion of information technology, the economics of information technology, which is a very interesting and a growing area. Oh, I thought that was me. Okay. Actually, the subject of information technology has come up a couple of times during the week in various discussions. In fact, in the panel, the micro panel yesterday, someone asked a question about sort of in today's fast-moving economy with rapid technological change, particularly in the IT sector, is that good or bad for liberty? Is it the case that the government can't keep up with the high-tech sector and can't effectively regulate the high-tech sector, and what's the implication of that? We had a little bit of discussion at that point. On the other hand, many interventionists argue that the so-called new economy, the information economy, has certain characteristics that make it in greater need of regulation than the old economy. That markets for information goods, that markets with network effects and so on don't work as well as regular markets, and therefore an even heavier hand of intervention, of monitoring, of government regulation is needed to make these markets work right. So I just want to survey this area briefly this morning and touch on some of these themes. I don't have many definitive answers for you, but I want to suggest some ideas that I would like you to think about. And I think this is an area that's ripe for further research and investigation. Those of you who are looking for thesis topics or whatever, I think you'll find a lot of potential in this field. Well, let me begin by talking about the so-called new economy, the economy that's dominated by information technology, the information economy, the information age, the new age in which we live. That phrase, new economy, that term, began to be very popular in the mid-1990s, both in the regular business press, but also in the academic literature in economics. People were talking about the new economy and what it is and how it was different from the old economy. Well, what the heck is it? What was the term new economy supposed to mean? Well, when this term was used during the stock market boom, mid to late 90s, some commentators said, well, the new economy means there's no more business cycle. Right? That in the old economy we had ups and downs, but in the new information age, the lighter economy, the knowledge economy, blah, 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 we have no need for, there will never be a downturn again because now we have e-commerce and we have new forms of doing business which are not affected by sort of, general economic conditions. We don't have to worry about another recession. Well, fortunately, people aren't saying that anymore. There's a little need to belabor that point. Obviously, that's a silly concept of the term. That's a silly sense of the economy being new. Obviously, it's not. There were other slightly less nutty, more reasonable uses of that term to describe, sort of ways in which for example, the characteristics of the manufacturing sector might be different in the 90s than in the 80s or the 70s or something like that. For example, you often hear people say, well, the old economy was based on manufacturing. The economies that were strong and performed well were based in manufacturing, had strong manufacturing sectors, whereas in the new economy, the key sector is the service sector. So it's more important to be strong in services rather than manufacturing. That's not an unreasonable statement. There's some evidence that the service sector is more of a driver of growth in the last decade than the manufacturing sector. Not overwhelming evidence, but at least that's it's a reasonable point that someone could make. Not clear what the significance would be. In a similar fashion, others argued that the characteristic feature of the new economy was the importance of intangible assets rather than tangible assets. So in the old economy, a company would thrive if it had a lot of physical capital, machines and assembly lines and so on. A steel company that had an efficient manufacturing process would be a strong company. Whereas in the new economy, what really matters for corporate performance is the knowledge that a firm has, knowledge capital, which might be embodied in something like research and development, accumulated R&D. There were attempts to try to measure this in terms of things like patents, how many a firm's patent portfolio as a measure of its stock of its knowledge stock, and therefore as a key to its performance. There was a lot of discussion of things like brand name reputation. Think of a company like Amazon.com, right? Amazon doesn't have much physical capital. The asset that Amazon.com has is its name, right? The fact that people trust Amazon, you're willing to type your credit card number into and give that to Amazon.com because you have confidence that they won't, abuse it. They won't take your money and run. Whereas, Jim Bob's website, rinky-dink website, you're not going to type your credit card number into that because you don't know, you don't trust the host. So it's certainly true that there are companies whose primary asset is reputation, brand name awareness, and so on. Is that more important today than it was in the past? It's very difficult to say. Again, this is not a crazy point. It's not an unreasonable point, but I think it's certainly been overblown because brand name reputation has always been important. And as some critics have pointed out, it's not clear that the IT sector is more knowledge intensive than the manufacturing sector. It took a lot of knowledge to put together the first intercontinental railroads. The invention of the Bessemer process for manufacturing steel is every bit as knowledge intensive as any part of the e-commerce sector or producing microchips or whatever. So it's difficult to get a handle on this. But as I say, it's a reasonable thing to talk about. It's an interesting question to ask, worthy of some research and analysis. Finally, others, particularly economists, use the term new economy to refer to different kinds of market competition. Markets in the new economy are somehow different than markets were in the old economy. For example, in the old economy, firms primarily competed with each other. In the new economy, there's more cooperation or collaboration. That firms form networks and alliances and have these complex relationships. There are more joint ventures, for example, in the tech sector than in the manufacturing sector. That firms have got to find new ways to capture spillover effects, network effects, etc. And so maybe markets in the IT sector behave a little bit differently from markets in the traditional sector. There was a book that was popular a few years ago by two prominent economists called Co-opetition, which was supposed to be a hybrid between competition and cooperation. They said in the new economy, firms don't really compete with each other. They don't fully cooperate either. They do something in between called co-opetition. And it's an interesting book, though a little bit silly in places. Well, the reason I'm bringing this up is because a common refrain you heard from, not necessarily from professional economists, but from business writers, from journalists, politicians, in the 1990s was that because we have a new economy, we also need a new economics. That the old economics doesn't apply anymore. It may have been true for the old economy that demand curves were downward sloping, but in the new economy they might be upward sloping. Some of you may know writers, I'll mention these guys in a minute, like Brian Arthur, for example, a guy from the Santa Fe Institute, not an economist, but someone who wrote a lot on economic topics and was quoted favorably by Business Week and Fortune and all the establishment outlets. As how sort of because the economy was different, economic theory didn't work anymore. You couldn't use supply and demand. You couldn't talk about diminishing returns and so on. A good example, the concept of increasing returns to scale, right? The idea that the larger the scale of operation, the more efficient the production process. You can produce at a lower cost, lower unit cost, the larger the scale of operation. Well, we've always been able to describe certain production processes that have that characteristic. People say, well, in the new economy, there's massive increasing returns. And so, all these questions about, issues about sort of the limits to the firm, they don't apply anymore. You're always going to have one giant firm that dominates every market, like Microsoft, Intel, Amazon.com, and so on. In the markets for certain kinds of goods, like so-called information goods, where you're providing information rather than tangible products, you'll always have one firm dominating the market because of these massive increasing returns. The idea was that in these markets, you have high fixed costs and low variable costs, right? So, to produce a website, Yahoo directory listing or something, there's a high initial cost of setting it up, but then the cost of serving one additional user, i.e. the cost of hosting one additional hit, is basically zero. Or if you're writing software code, it costs a lot to develop Windows XP, but once you've got the code written, the cost of pressing one additional CD is, 2 cents. So you have these massive fixed costs, almost zero marginal costs. Therefore, one firm, you can only have one firm in each sector. Only one firm can thrive. Right? Therefore, all the stuff about competition, selection, survival of the fittest, selecting out inefficient entrepreneurs, none of that stuff works anymore, said the critics. Well, I'm sure you won't be surprised to hear that I think that's a bunch of hooey. Okay, in fact, the regular economics or the economics you've been learning this week still applies as much as it always did. Okay, the laws of praxeology are not affected by the development of the internet. Okay, so the theories that we've been discussing this week still apply equally strongly to these markets, and I'll talk about some specific examples in just a few moments. Okay. What about these so-called information goods? What about markets for information goods, where the output is information rather than something tangible? There's a lot of interesting discussion about this. There are a lot of interesting phenomena that are worthy of study and analysis, and I'll just mention some. What they call versioning, the ability of firms producing information goods to produce different versions of the good, at low cost to the producer. The basic version and the deluxe version. Windows XP Home and XP Pro, right? Or Real Player Basic as opposed to Real Player Pro or what have you. And many writers have pointed out that this can be an effective form of price discrimination by the firm, right? You have sort of the basic product that you give away for free to the potential buyers with very elastic demands, and then you have a deluxe version that you charge more money for, and that version, you market that to users with less elastic demands. Okay, and because it's easy to price discriminate in these cases, the firm can make money selling the more expensive version and can afford to give away the other version for free. Okay, that's why you can download Adobe Acrobat Reader for free. Why are they giving away something for nothing? Well, it's because they're making money selling the full version of Acrobat, right, which includes not only a better version of the reader that allows you to do more things, but also a complementary product, the product that allows you to create PDF files. So it's easier for firms to price discriminate when they can produce multiple versions at low cost. Perfectly valid insight in business management. There's been discussion of things like the increased importance of customer loyalty in markets for information goods, that sellers in this sector will often try to reward frequent customers to build up customer loyalty, giving kind of like frequent flyer points. The importance of branding we already mentioned. Markets for information goods, in these markets, these markets also facilitate some what we might call aggressive, which doesn't mean evil, okay, aggressive business practices, like what they call Vaporware, which is where a company announces that it's planning to release a new product, even if it's really not ready to release that product, with the goal of keeping its existing users from switching to somebody else's product. Okay, so you're using, you're using WordPerfect, and you're thinking about switching to Word. So Corel tells you we're about to come out with a new version of WordPerfect. You say, oh, well, I'll wait till the new version of WordPerfect comes out. I won't switch to Word, even though they really don't have a new version of WordPerfect. Okay, so there are many. There are many margins for aggressive tactics in markets for information goods, which is not to say there's anything wrong with those tactics. Again, these are all interesting topics. Some of you may have seen a book by Carl Shapiro and Hal Varian, the title of which escapes me at the moment. Information Rules. Yeah, Information Rules, that's it. That discusses these phenomena. It's very, very interesting. But the point is, let's not make a big deal about it. Right? This is nothing new. There's nothing fundamentally different. This is no challenge for economic theory. These sorts of phenomena have always existed. As has been pointed out by some writers, a telephone directory is an information good. In exactly the same way as, a web listing or a listing site or a piece of software. It costs a lot more money to gather the names than it does to print additional copies of the phone book. Okay? But the fact that there are increasing returns and so on in the production of a directory listing doesn't mean that you can only have one provider of a phone book. Okay, we have competing telephone directories in most markets. In other words, one can look back in history and find many, many examples of goods and services that have exactly these same characteristics. So, this is not specific to IT. It's nothing new. It's no big deal. It's nothing to get all worked up about. What about network effects, or as they are often mistakenly called, network externalities? Well, I want to introduce the concept of network effects, which figure prominently in this literature by talking about Microsoft. I'm not going to go into all the details of the Microsoft case, or the Microsoft cases, plural. As most of you know, Microsoft has been the target of several antitrust investigations, 2 major ones in the U.S., and an ongoing investigation in Europe. In fact, the EU just this week announced a ruling, ruled against Microsoft in a case there. And of course, the U.S. case was settled, but there's continuing negotiation, and there's some continuing problems there. The reason I want to talk about Microsoft is because the main case against Microsoft had to do with this concept of network effects or network externalities, as they're sometimes called. It is true that in the part of the attack on Microsoft was on sort of traditional antitrust grounds. Illegal tying of the operating system to the browser, trying to leverage a monopoly in one market into a monopoly in another market. Those were all part of the complaint against Microsoft. But what made the Microsoft case different is this basic underlying theme that Microsoft is a big company whose products are no good, okay, according to the critics. How did Microsoft get to be a big company? Well, not because it produces products and services that consumers desire, but because of something called network effects, combined with some of its business practices, like restrictive licensing. What exactly are network effects? A network effect is said to be present when the value of using a particular good or service is a function of how many other people are using that good or service. Okay? The value of having some particular good and service, consuming some good or service, depends on how many other people are also consuming the same good or service. Right? Like email, for instance. The value of having an email account depends on how many other people use email. If none of your friends and business contacts use email, it's not of much value to you. In fact, I'm old enough to remember when I was a grad student in the late 80s, and email was just coming into common usage. Email's been around since the 60s, but was just used by some scientists and military types. But I remember when I was a graduate student, some of my friends started using email. I remember one friend and was communicating with a friend overseas using email, and I said, what is that? And for a while, I didn't have any interest in it. I thought, well, that's some kind of geeky techno thing. Yeah, email, shmemail. But, none of my friends used it, so what would have been the point? But of course now, my philosophy now is, if you don't use email, I don't want to be your friend. Okay? I don't want to communicate with you by any other means. But the reason that email is valuable to me is because everybody else has it. Or others have said, imagine being the first person in the world to have a fax machine. What would you do with it? Okay. What's the significance of this? Well, because, according to the critics, because of network effects, it's often the case that a technology, a type of product, a type of service that's not the most efficient one, not the best one, ends up winning out in the market. Right? Normally we think if there are two products battling it out head to head, Ford and Chevy, then the best product will win. The product that best satisfies consumer wants will end up out-competing the other product. That's the standard story that we tell in economics and in Austrian economics. Well, the network effects guys, the network externality guys say, this doesn't work in markets with network effects. The reason is, they say that, imagine that you have two competing products, and one of them happens for some completely arbitrary reason to have a little bit of a head start. Right? So, there are 10 people using product A and 10 people using product B, and, just by accident, a new person comes along and begins using product B. So there are 11 people using B and 10 people using A. So now, the next potential customer comes along and is trying to decide whether to use product A or product B. Well, if there's a strong network effect, which product is that person going to prefer? B, because there are 11 people using B and only 10 people using A. And you want to use the one that has the most other users. Okay, so the next person chooses B. Then the next person who comes along, now it's 12 to 10, that person chooses B and so on. And before you know it, almost everybody's using B. Not because B was a better product than A, but because in the early stages, B just happened to have one more user than A. Maybe that 11th user of B, just flipped a coin or something. So because of random accident or what have you, one product might have a slightly larger market share than another. And once it has a larger market share, then it just grows and dominates. The other product can't compete. This phenomena is known as path dependence. Path dependence. In other words, the distribution of market share today is a function of the distribution of market share yesterday and the day before that and so on. We kind of get stuck on a path, maybe the wrong path, an inefficient path, because of these network effects. For example, to use some of the famous examples in this literature, the QWERTY typewriter keyboard, the QWERTY keyboard layout. In fact, sometimes these are called, QWERTY effects or QWERTY markets or whatever. An economic historian called Paul David at Stanford University wrote a very influential article on the QWERTY keyboard, where he told the following story. He said, in the early days of the typewriter, early 20th century, there were many, many different competing keyboard layouts. Right? The QWERTY layout that has become the standard today was just one of dozens of different layouts that competed against each other. In fact, David argues, there are many reasons to think that the QWERTY keyboard is not really all that efficient. I mean, if you think about it, right, with QWERTY, the pinkies do a lot of work. And they're small and weak fingers. The thumbs don't do much. The left thumb doesn't do anything. The right thumb just hits the space bar. There are alternative layouts that are thought to be, from an ergonomic point of view, more efficient. One of which, the one that David talks about, I don't have a marker. Oh yeah. What's called the Dvorak keyboard. Named after its inventor, a Russian immigrant, Dvorak. No, a Czech immigrant, actually, sorry. The Dvorak keyboard has a different layout. You can get this today. You can get some software to make your computer keyboard work on Dvorak as well. And David argued that Dvorak was really a better keyboard than QWERTY. But what happened is, in the early days of the typewriter, as a publicity stunt, typewriter manufacturers would organize contests, typing speed contests. And there was this one typist who just happened to use QWERTY and was a fast typist and won some of the contests. And therefore people thought, well, QWERTY must be pretty good. And more people started to use QWERTY. And before you knew it, lots and lots of people were using QWERTY. Right? Clearly, this is a market where the network effect is relevant. Because, you want to know the same keyboard, you want to use the same keyboard layout that everybody else uses. If you're trained on Dvorak, then you go to somebody else's house, they have QWERTY, you can't type, right? You get a new computer, or in those days, a new typewriter where you couldn't just change the keys around, right? You would only be able to type on your Dvorak keyboard. You want to be trained to type on the standard layout. So there's certainly an advantage in having a standard keyboard layout where everyone uses the same one. And by historical accident, David said QWERTY, won out. And now here we are stuck with QWERTY when Dvorak is really more efficient. But, we can't break out of that. We can't switch because everyone would have to switch at the same time. Nobody wants to be the first one to switch because then you'd be at a disadvantage relative to everyone else. Okay. Network externalities, it is argued, are a new source of market failure. Right? This is an example where the market has failed. The market gave us QWERTY, and QWERTY is not the best standard. Other examples that are famous in the literature, some of you old-timers may remember the battle between the VHS cassette format and the Sony Betamax format. It's another very frequent example in the literature. When VCRs first came out in the early 70s, there were competing standards. There was the VHS standard, the one we have now, and also the Sony Betamax standard. The Betamax cassette was smaller, and the picture quality was higher. And so the Sony Beta machines were perceived to be higher quality, and sort of the technophiles, used Betamax. But VHS won out, and there are some accounts that say it has something to do with the availability of X-rated movies on the VHS format. But the point is, right, you have the same kind of VCR that everyone else has, so you can exchange movies and so you can rent movies and so on. You don't want to be the only person in town with a Betamax machine. You can't rent movies that will fit the machine. When I was a kid, you'd go into the Blockbuster or whatever it was called then, and each movie had two different cassettes. Right? There was the bigger VHS cassette and then the smaller Beta cassette for the same movie. But the VHS standard won out. Again, according to Paul David, VHS is an inferior standard relative to Betamax. But yet that's the one that won out. Again, market failure. Another famous example, the battle between the MS-DOS operating system and the Macintosh operating system. When the Mac first came out in 1984, it was a huge technological advance over the IBM PC-based machines of the day. Again, for you old-timers, you might remember the days before the graphical user interface. Okay, the Macintosh was the first popular machine to have a mouse and to have windows and icons. Right? Everybody else at the time was using the IBM machines, which of course you just type on in text. dir, backslash, you guys remember that CD, backslash, colon, blah, 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 blah. That's the way everybody did it. And those of you who are into Linux, or some other Unix-based system where you do you type your type your commands in, on a command line. That was the way everybody did it. And then here comes this machine with a mouse and pictures and cutesy little graphics. I remember a friend of mine in college getting an early Mac, and we were all fascinated by, what is a mouse? What do you do with it? None of us could figure out how to work the mouse. It took a long time. Okay. So the argument goes, that's really a much better, a much more efficient setup than MS-DOS. But there's a network effect, right? There's a compatibility issue. You didn't want to be the only person around with a Mac if everyone else had a PC, because then, the diskettes weren't compatible. This is before the internet, before FTP, whatever. If you wanted to exchange files, you had to have a floppy. A Mac couldn't read an IBM formatted floppy and vice versa. The available software was different. So it's argued, even though the Macintosh was a far superior system, MS-DOS ended up being the dominant standard because of this network effect. Okay, that's how Microsoft got to be so big, because it is in a market with network effects, and Microsoft had kind of a head start, and so the competing Mac standard could never really catch on, even though it was a better standard. So we're stuck with the less efficient operating system as our de facto standard. Those are the kinds of arguments that you see. Paul David, who I mentioned earlier, actually goes quite a bit farther, as these seemingly wacky ideas about the steam engine really being more efficient than the internal combustion engine, but yet we're stuck with internal combustion engines because of network externalities, blah, blah, blah. Okay, what can we say about this? Is it true that network effects or network externalities are cause for concern? Do they give rise to market failure? Do we need new theories to explain them? Well, I would, not surprisingly, answer no. There's no cause for concern here. Why? Well, the network externality arguments can be criticized on several grounds. Well, one is what we might call imperfect knowledge. Right? It's certainly true that when market participants choose among competing standards, right, they're trying to anticipate what they think will be the advantages of using one standard or another, over time. And they may get it wrong. Right? The market may select standard B over standard A, and then 20 years later we think, oh, it turned out that A was really better than B. Well, again, that by itself is not that's not an example of market failure if nobody at the time knew that A was going to be better than B. Right? We always make choices as consumers in the face of imperfect knowledge about the future. And of course the market may get it wrong in that sense, but that has to do with imperfect knowledge, not any kind of market failure. Right? The relevant question would be, would the government, for example, have been in a position to make a better decision at the time? One would have to argue that market participants thought B was going to be better, mistakenly, but some government agency knew that A was really going to be better and they were systematically right. The market was systematically wrong. That doesn't seem very plausible. Switchover costs. Even if it's true that technology A is really better than technology B, yet we're all stuck here using technology B, what does it mean to say that B is less efficient than A if it would be very costly to switch to A? So suppose we all agreed that Dvorak is really better than QWERTY. There would be some gain from switching from QWERTY to Dvorak if the whole society could switch. But yet the costs of switching are very high. Right? If the costs of switching, in some sense, exceed the benefits that we would have from being on Dvorak rather than QWERTY, then QWERTY is efficient. Right? Given the switchover cost, it's not worth it to switch. So it's not that the market has failed, it's that given where we are today, given what happened in the past, decisions we can't go back and undo, what we have, the status quo is pretty much the best we can have, given the cost of switching. That's a point that's often overlooked in the network externality literature. I have an idea that, as far as I know, has not been expressed by anyone but myself, therefore it must be extremely brilliant, that the externalities argument, network externalities argument, it ignores the concept of the margin. It ignores marginal analysis. It thinks in terms of sort of overall homogeneous categories rather than discrete units. Let me explain what I mean. In the Microsoft case, for instance, in the antitrust trial, some of the prosecution witnesses said, well, imagine a rival operating system. Someone comes up with a new operating system to rival Windows. And they use a real world example. Let's not do Linux because it's a special case. There's an obscure operating system that's popular among graphic designers called the B operating system, BEOS it's called. Has sort of a small cult following. Suppose that somebody invents the B operating system, BEOS, and they want to try to challenge Microsoft. The standard argument goes they can't, right? Because no one would want to use the BOS unless a bunch of other people are also using the BOS. I, as an average user, am not going to switch to the BOS unless all of the standard applications that I use are available for that platform. Right? In the Microsoft case, they made a big to-do about this sort of chicken and egg problem that for an operating system to thrive, there must be a lot of applications written for that system. Right? There has to be PowerPoint for the BOS for me to want to switch to it because I need PowerPoint. Right? But no applications designers are willing to write applications for a platform that doesn't have a big following. So you're kind of stuck. There's this catch-22. No one will switch to the rival operating system because you can't get, the WordPerfect for that system. And Corel won't write WordPerfect for that system because not enough people are using it. So, you're stuck. You can't break out of this. Problem with this argument is that you don't have to get everybody to switch for it to be profitable to produce the rival system. For example, it is certainly true, in my opinion, that no one could produce, from scratch, brand new, a full-fledged operating system with all the capabilities and features of Windows XP and jump into the market and, capture half of the market. It could never happen for the reasons that I've just described. But that doesn't mean that no one can compete with Microsoft. Right? Competing with Microsoft doesn't mean offering a product that is battling out Windows head-to-head. There's no reason why someone couldn't compete by producing a small niche product that attracts a few specialized users. Right? So I create a small operating system, the Klein OS, that is marketed towards Austrian economists, let's say. It has, keywords like praxeology in the spelling dictionary. And, even though I don't offer all the features of Windows, I offer enough features that a few users on the margin will want to switch. Not everybody, but a few. I get I get 10 Austrian professors to use my system. Is that enough to convince Corel to write a version of WordPerfect for the Klein OS? No. Okay, but so I don't have WordPerfect. I have some other some little rinky-dink word processor. And that's good enough to keep these 10 marginal users happy. Right, well, then somebody comes along and says, okay, if there's 10 users, I'm willing to write a slightly better word processing program for you. And then I'm able to attract a few more. I get a bunch of you guys, and now I have 20 or 30 users. And in this small, incremental, step-by-step fashion, I can actually increase my market share. Not by trying to attract the massive users, but by attracting a few users on the margin. And who's to say that after a certain amount of time, it might reach the point where I can effectively compete with the larger established competitor. But again, in the Microsoft case, they always talked about competition with Microsoft, meaning a huge rival that has 50% of the market share. Well, that's not a requirement for competition. Small rivals sort of nipping at your heels can be a market like that is just as competitive as a market with two heavyweights battling it out. Okay. One additional point that I sort of alluded to earlier has to do with the way politics works, right? Politicized decision making. One could agree that the market sometimes gets it wrong in terms of choosing the wrong standard, but still think that's better than the alternatives. It's like the old joke. My grandmother says, getting old isn't so bad once you consider the alternative. Okay? So, say we agree the market fails. The market is not capable of choosing technological standards. Okay, so what do we do about it? So we create a government agency, the job of which is to pick technological standards. Well, do we think that agency would be more likely to choose the right standard than the market? Of course not. Everything we know about how the political process works, everything we know about political economy and the public choice literature and all this suggests that government standard-setting body would be much less likely to choose the right standard. It would be politicized. It would be dominated by special interests. It would, choose the technology produced by the company that's located in the state, represented by some powerful congressman or whatever. Where there's someone to make any to draw any conclusions from the network externalities argument any political conclusion, someone would have to show that there's a feasible alternative to market-based standard setting that would be more desirable. And Paul David and Brian Arthur and these critics have never attempted to do that. It's sort of the nirvana fallacy. They say, well, the market is not as, is less than, the market isn't perfection, therefore we need government regulation. Obviously that's only half the story. Government regulation might make it worse. Fortunately, we don't even have to concede that point about the market choosing the wrong standard. Because, as has been shown in path-breaking work by two neoclassical economists, Stan Leibowitz and Steve Margolis, in fact, the market hasn't failed in any meaningful sense. In fact, as Leibowitz and Margolis have demonstrated, there are no convincing real-world examples where the market has gotten it wrong, where the market chose the wrong standard. Take the QWERTY case. In a famous article published in 1990 called The Fable of the Keys, which was a pun on a famous 18th century work by Bernard Mandeville, The Fable of the Bees, Leibowitz and Margolis did a history of the QWERTY keyboard. And they found out that, in fact, Paul David's claims about the superiority of Dvorak were false, were bogus, were not borne out by any actual historical investigation. What happened is that, well, first of all, the ergonomic literature suggests that any keyboard layout is basically as good as any other. That what affects typing speed and accuracy is repetition. Some layouts are easier to learn than others, but once you get to be a decent typist, you can type equally well on any layout. Okay. What happened in the early days of typewriting, they did have these typewriting contests, but there were lots of contests all over the country with lots of different participants, and QWERTY users won just as often as non-QWERTY users. It wasn't just, one weird guy who happened to be good at QWERTY. QWERTY seemed to do just as well as any other layout at the time. It turns out that the claims for the sort of scientific superiority of the Dvorak keyboard, on which Paul David based his article, all came from one study, a study done by the U.S. Navy, which turned out to have been authored by none other than Mr. Dvorak, the creator of the keyboard. So there's no evidence that QWERTY is worse than Dvorak or any other standard. What about the Vhs and Betamax? Well, there's a very important point here that it's certainly true that the Beta was a better product than VHS from an engineering point of view. From a technological point of view, the Betamax was sort of a more elegant solution. Higher resolution, more information stored per square millimeter of tape or whatever. And the cassettes were more compact. The recorders were more compact. So Beta was better than VHS from a technological point of view. The problem is the market is not concerned with technological superiority per se. The market is concerned with economic superiority. The best product in the marketplace means the product that it can best satisfy consumer wants. Well, how did VHS and Beta stack up in that regard? VHS was far superior. Why? The Beta machines were much more expensive than the VHS machines. The Beta cassettes were smaller, but the early Beta cassettes could only record 30 minutes worth of video. You could only have 30 minutes worth of video on a Beta cassette, whereas you could record for 2 hours on a VHS cassette. And then when they introduced, the extended play mode, up to 6 hours. So in the early days of VCRs, right, to the average consumer, the fact that Beta had a slightly better picture wasn't worth it. Right? The VHS picture quality was good enough. The machines were much cheaper, and you could record longer. So consumers decided they preferred, recording time over picture quality. And who can say that they were wrong in that sense? One can never know ex ante how consumer preferences will work themselves out. It's kind of like with cell phones. Nokia became very successful in the early 90s with cell phones because, in the late 80s, no one knew exactly what kinds of cell phones consumers would want. Ericsson was a big rival to Nokia in those days, and they each made a gamble, right? Ericsson gambled that consumers would value features primarily, and so Ericsson packed as many features as possible into its phones. Nokia gambled that consumers would prefer size and weight over features. So Nokia made phones that were smaller and lighter, even though they had fewer features than Ericsson's phones. Which is better? Well, from a pure engineering point of view, it's hard to say. It turned out that consumers did in fact prefer smaller and lighter phones over phones that were larger and heavier but had more features. And so Nokia's market share grew rapidly and Ericsson's shrank. But again, there's no way to know which is the best product in terms of satisfying consumer wants without letting the market work it out. Letting the market work all this out. Same thing with MS-DOS and the Mac. Again, the people who say the Macintosh was better in 1984 than MS-DOS machines are people who say that are software engineers, computer geeks. Okay. Which is not to say that they're wrong. From their point of view, from a designer's point of view, from a programmer's point of view, the Mac solution, again, is much more elegant than the clunky MS-DOS solution. But that has nothing to do with economic superiority. Again, if you've ever seen one of the old Macs or ever used one of the old Macs, they were incredibly slow, much slower than an IBM PC, and also much more expensive. Right? And you got to remember, at the time when those machines were introduced, the set of activities that computer users typically performed are a lot more limited than the set of activities they perform today. No web browsing, not much sort of graphics, multimedia kind of applications. Basically what people used computers for in those days was word processing and, database or spreadsheet applications. And, if you have ever used the old text-based word processors like WordStar, to type a letter, which is what people did. You could do it in a fourth the time using WordStar on an IBM machine than you could using Microsoft Word on the Mac. Okay, so the Mac was kind of a cute toy, but it wasn't very practical. It wasn't a very useful machine for the typical computer user. So who can say that the MS-DOS standard was worse? Right? It wasn't from the point of view of the user. There's a fundamental point that I want you to take away, that there's a difference between technological superiority and economic superiority. And what the market selects for is economic superiority, not technological superiority. Okay. Let me make a brief point about the Internet, and then we'll stop. Actually, let's not make a point about the Internet. Let's make a different point. I have 2 slides left to go. I'm trying to decide which one to do. The Internet's very important. Actually, what might be more interesting, I'll just close with this in just 1 minute, is that it has to do with the open source software movement. Some of you may be interested in this, and a lot of Austrians, some Austrians have made a big to-do about it, and I think it's really overblown. You all know about open source software like Linux is where it's not controlled, but the code is not proprietary, but it's freely available to anyone. So anyone can go and modify the source code, and their improvements can be incorporated into the master product. And some Austrians have argued that, open source software is better than proprietary software. It should be better because it's more like the free market, right? So a piece of software that's designed and controlled by a company like Microsoft, that's kind of analogous to central planning, sort of top-down solution to solving problem, whereas open source is a more decentralized, open-ended solution. We let the market work to figure out what's the best way to, achieve the function that the software is designed to achieve. sometimes you hear people say, some Austrians say that open source solutions rely on spontaneous order. Linux is an example of a product created through spontaneous order, as opposed to Windows, which is created by top-down central planning. I don't think this point is really on target, because what it misses is that this pertains to a lecture earlier this week on the theory of the firm. That on the free market, there certainly are advantages to central planning, quote unquote, if by central planning what we mean is entrepreneurs organizing activities within firms. Okay? When we defend the free market, we don't mean that every transaction must be a decentralized sort of spot market transaction between two independent units. On the free market, we will tend to see firms. And in some cases where production inside the firm is more efficient than production between firms, we can even see very large firms. And so we can't say ex ante what is sort of the optimal size of the firm on the free market. We will see some large firms. Smaller firms, networks of small firms aren't better from an Austrian perspective than production within large firms. We just have to see how the market works it out in any particular case. And it's exactly the same thing with software. I mean, there may be cases where the centrally planned solution is better than the decentralized solution, as long as the quote-unquote central planning solution arises on the free market. In other words, there's no violation of private property rights, no coercion. Nothing prevents a group of programmers from getting together and designating themselves a firm and having a supervisor who gives them direction and does planning and so on. I mean, that's perfectly 100% consistent with the free market. As an aside, one could point out that the people who make this point sort of sometimes argue that all open source products are better than all proprietary products. That certainly isn't true. And there are some great open source projects like Linux and other versions of Unix, the Apache web server, the SendMail program, which we all use, it runs in the background, sending your email, is open source. But there are also some open source projects that have been a dud, like Netscape's attempt to make the underlying code for the Netscape browser open source through its Mozilla project. It turned out to be a bust. Open source works sometimes it doesn't. The point is, sort of spontaneous order, if interpreted correctly, just means the free market solution, which certainly can include proprietary software. Okay, so the bottom line, the point of all this is that the same basic principles of the market economy apply in the technology sector. Okay? If antitrust regulation, for example, is not justified in steel manufacturing, it's not justified in software either. Okay, the fact that technology markets may have some different structural characteristics doesn't affect the basic arguments about the advantages of markets relative to government planning and so on. Yeah, and what one might point out, as I pointed out yesterday in my answer to the question about does the high-tech sector move too fast for the government? I mean, in a sense it does. The government doesn't really understand what's going on in the technology sector, and can't sort of effectively regulate it from the government's point of view. But that's not to say the government can't do a heck of a lot of damage through arbitrary intervention and regulation and legislation and so on. So we shouldn't be sanguine about it and think, oh, well, we shouldn't be, flippant about it and say, well, because of the high-tech society, the government can't keep up anymore. We can encrypt our email. They can't read it. They can't keep track of our financial transactions, so government's going to sort of wither and go away. I don't really see that happening. I mean, the government can still constrain or limit what goes on in the technology sector. It's still a danger, just as much as it ever was, maybe even more.